Controlling cryptocurrencies have been likened to containing water in your hands. It's impossible. We've seen jurisdictions like South Korea and China come down hard on crypto for the demand to spring up elsewhere. Canada and Japan are two countries who have proven to be favorable towards blockchain and are becoming crypto gold mines. The world of blockchain is Internet 1992. The Amazons, Googles, and Facebooks of the space are starting to become apparent. There is one company in particular that is strategically positioned as the most diversified blockchain play in the world, with strongholds in Japan and Canada. Do not miss out on the early positioning in crypto. To learn more about how to profitably ride this remarkable trend, visit crushthestreet.com/blockchain. Hello everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. I'm Kenneth Amaduri, and I'm joined today with a brand new guest. Her name is Sheila Warren, head of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. She's with weforum.org, and she's been serving in the nonprofit sector now for over a decade. She began her career as a Wall Street attorney before turning to philanthropy and nonprofit tech for over a decade. And she loves what she does, and I was just having a pre-interview with her here. We're going to learn about blockchain tech and really where this can help humanity. I think that's where this whole sector has derived so much of its value from, and we're going to extract some of that here today. Sheila, thanks for joining me on Crush the Street.
Thanks, Ken. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start off by how you first got introduced to blockchain and how you ended up just pouring so much attention into it. What grabbed your attention when you learned about Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, I think I had a pretty traditional introduction to this in the sense that I started off as an investor. And what happened actually was my husband and I were early investors, not really early, but early dabblers, I should say, in Bitcoin. We saw it, we thought of it as an alternative to gold, essentially, as a value store. We sold it because we freaked out after we bought a house, as one does. But then what happened at that house is helicopters began circling one day. And we went on Twitter, as one does, and figured out what was going on was that they were busting up Silk Road 2 blocks from our apartment. And my husband turned to me and said, "Hey, babe, Bitcoin just went on sale." So we wound up buying back in. And that was kind of where it sat for me for a little while. And we became interested in other forms of currency as they became developed, et cetera. But in my last job, where I worked at a nonprofit tech company, we had one of the largest databases in the world for nonprofit organizations. And a couple of friends of mine had begun working on blockchain tech, which I didn't even know what blockchain was. I'd heard of Bitcoin and Ethereum, but I had no idea what blockchain was. And they were talking about it one day, and I had this light bulb go off, as happens to many enthusiasts, where I realized there were all of these applications that had nothing to do with currency or money in any fashion, and that this technology had the potential to really upend systems, including the philanthropic system and including aid and development. So I became very fascinated by it, and then I had that activation moment where I was up in the middle of the night just thinking about potential use cases and getting really excited. And when the World Economic Forum came knocking and said they were focused on policy in the blockchain space, that was tremendously interesting to me because of the wide scope of the role. So I wound up here late last fall.
Okay, so I do want to get into some of the blockchain applications, but I'm very curious, how did you deal with 2017 getting in at a very good time and watching the price of the entire space just absolutely skyrocket?
Yeah, well, I suppose I touched wood and and crossed my fingers a little bit, like a lot of people did, but I also think that it was a bit disheartening for me, frankly, professionally, because I felt like a lot of the hype and the volatility in the currency and the steep rise in it attracted more gold rush mentality to the technology than some of the other applications about which I'd become so bullish, right? And I think I'm happy to see, frankly, if I may be really candid, a little bit of rationalization coming to the space, because I feel like now we're seeing an explosion of not just currency token, applications and payment protocols, but also some of these other applications that I think are are really interesting and, again, have the potential to be just as wide sweeping as some people think digital currency can be.
Is it fair, though, to say that Bitcoin or blockchain in general would not have done what it, or at least been legitimized, had we not seen this big rise in price?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I think it's a little bit of a philosophical one. I mean, certainly, when you want to have a Precambrian explosion around any emerging technology, right? Because there's going to be hundreds of use cases to develop, most of which won't go anywhere, but then the ones that do get ripe, are going to really spawn something quite exciting. And so I certainly don't begrudge the space, this, and I certainly don't begrudge anybody who came and made a ton of money and exited, obviously, at all. I think that's a standard new tech approach, and I use tech very broadly. I think the same thing probably happened, for all I know, when the steam engine was developed. Right, there were probably a lot of people developing prototypes around that, and a couple people made it big, and some of the other prototypes died out on the vine. So I don't think it's that different. I guess what I find a little bit hard is the concern that as regulation gets put into place, which I think is inevitable and not a bad thing. I'm not an anti-regulation person as a general matter. But I do worry that there might be a stifling effect on the core technology itself, which I think would be a problem. We're not ready for that yet. I don't think we're ready to really bound this in a way that cuts off some of the potential applications.
Well, let's get right into it. That's the perfect segue. Where are you most excited about blockchain technology going, and really the new services for people?
Yeah. I think that I'll come out and say quite candidly that I think the most exciting applications of blockchain are not actually happening in the United States. I think they're actually happening in countries where this technology can actually leapfrog certain kinds of systems that either haven't been developed in a particularly robust way or haven't been developed at all. So when I think about my work here at the World Economic Forum, we're really not focusing as much on, G7 countries, not literally, but, sort of these really wealthy countries. We're focusing on kind of those like second tier, almost, if you will, countries from an economic perspective, where the potential to really address questions like the unbanked and underbanked, remittances, the provision of things like decentralized power grids in rural populations, like all these kinds of things can really be addressed by this technology. And I think they can be addressed more easily than certain traditional systems that just haven't taken off for whatever reason in some of these areas.
So, yeah, I guess the percentage benefit in a lot of these countries that are dealing with such bad economic problems is much greater than, let's say, the Western world, which has some level of stability. And that's what I'm hearing from you, is these people are in such dire situations in some cases that this new technology provides such a value to them in an area of great need.
I think that's right. And I think that we are seeing a big influx of philanthropic attention to this technology. I think we are seeing a lot of nonprofit tech companies, for example, starting up in this space or that have been around or getting a little bit more traction on their build to address some of society's biggest problems: poverty, hunger, homelessness. Like, there are people and companies focused on these things. And I think that's just a really powerful and important thing to do with any emergent technology, particularly with something like this.
So what is the exact use case of blockchain that you see that can combat hunger and poverty? Is it simply the fact that some of these countries are bound by reckless governments, and the opportunity to store your wealth in something that is not controlled by these governments is such a value to a lot of these people?
I think that's part of it, but let me give you two concrete examples, two use cases I love to cite. One is the World Food Program. So they did this work around remittances and food stamps, essentially putting on the ledger the ability for people who are existing in food deserts, essentially, or in poverty, essentially, to be able to get food, to literally get food using these food stamps that were secured on the blockchain, so that there was no diversion of these assets. There was no ability to circumvent the process by which these people would get that kind of assistance. That was a successful program. They're looking now to scale it. It's a very interesting use case. Everything that's happening in the philanthropic space is relatively small scale, right? The money is not flowing into this space the way it did for some certain ICOs that were developing other kinds of applications. But the use case is there, and I think it's a matter of trying to see if there's the political will to really take those kinds of solutions and make them more broad scale. Another example I like is a company called Everledger, and they are doing work on supply chain around, let's call it fair trade mining. So they work in diamonds, and they're really focusing on taking a diamond from the moment that it's mined, ensuring that it's mined with fair trade practices and adherence to international processes that ensure it's not a conflict diamond, and then tracking that diamond all the way through the supply chain into the jewelry or wherever it winds up, whether it's the tip of a drill or whether it's a ring or whatever it winds up looking like, so that a consumer, a company, a consumer, a retailer, everyone can be assured that that particular diamond was obtained using processes that are humane. I think the implications there for labor and other sorts of operations are really, really interesting. And I think the effect on the lives of people who are in war-torn regions where these commodities are things people kill for is really interesting. And I'll say, to link this back to the origins, to some extent, of Bitcoin, the fact that this was used for illicit trade of things like drugs and arms and all of that, there was a legitimacy there, right? I mean, we may not like those goods and the transfer of those goods, but the fact that these kinds of nefarious, let's call them actors, trusted this system to get them a good means that we can deploy that same system for good.
That's an interesting point. So Sheila, I'm curious, are there any other blockchain applications out there that you see as just forcing themselves into this decentralized nature that doesn't really need to be decentralized, solving a problem that isn't there? Have you come across anything that you see as just unnecessary?
Yeah, it's hard to say with a broad sweep that certain things are necessary, but I will say when I started in this role, I had a tremendous amount of inbound people wanting to work with the forum on these topics and areas. And my question was always, why do you need, let's really walk through the nature of a distributed ledger and why is it you need that? So one thing we're doing is publishing what we're calling a decision-making toolkit that'll be coming out in a month or two. And it basically walks people who have no knowledge of blockchain. It's not blockchain 101, but it basically says, you understand the problem you're facing, whatever that is, whether you're a politician or a CEO of a company or whatever it is. Let's walk through the various elements of a distributed ledger and whether or not any of those elements is useful. So I had an awful lot of people come to me, and I would kind of say, why aren't you just using Google Docs with a password, or Slack or WhatsApp chat? I mean, why do you even need, why does this data have to be immutable? Why does the record have to be immutable? Why can't you? It sounds like you want centralization of the data, and so I think people hadn't really thought all of that through, and they came at it from a lens that was just focused on security enhancement, which, don't get me wrong, is very important, but it doesn't get you all the way there. There are other ways of achieving some of those goals without going all the way to blockchain.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So I guess maybe not on the philanthropic end. What are some of the other projects that are out there that you are excited about? And as far as technology, with blockchain and decentralized applications hitting the market here?
Yeah, well, one thing I'm really excited about is sort of the advent of the explosion of middleware, right? So a lot of corporates are starting to build layers, application layers, that essentially you can build your application in their product, and that will hook into any chain. So it's chain agnostic. And I think that's really interesting because it separates the ability to build protocol from the ability to build application. And it means that if you build something, you're not then bound to, the forking that may or may not happen, or even the abandonment of a particular protocol that you deemed worth your time. It also means we don't have to necessarily centralize applications in one or two protocols. So I like that. I think it's kind of, it has its own problems. I think anyone who works in middleware will tell you that there's a big name in the room I won't name right now, but people who build in that have their own issues around ownership of data and security. But I think that the advent of that kind of thing is going to be helpful in terms of separating out and giving us time to think about protocols in the blockchain space that don't yet exist. So that's one thing I think is interesting. That's kind of the less sexy but imperative thing. Another is just basic supply chain functionality. I personally think that supply chain integration and supply chain logistics is one of the areas where blockchain and DLT can be most helpful. I think we've seen a lot of experimentation in various kinds of supply chains, but we're talking about things like vaccine supply, everything from shipping supply chains to battery supply chains with circular economy and reuse, to vaccine supply chains and delivery and accountability in that supply chain, and to the remittance example I gave with the food stamps. And if you think about it, the flow of currency in philanthropic aid is in its own way a supply chain. So in my mind, those applications are where the bulk of the effort the use cases that are going to get more traction are going to be in the next 18 months, I would suspect.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think many people, like myself, for instance, I want to donate to people and help them. And a lot of times I feel like I prefer to do that directly in many cases. But if I had more confidence in where my money was going to go and that it was actually going to get to the end recipient, I might be more open to donating to, more charities, for instance. And I think that's an interesting point that you bring up about the, helping people in a philanthropic basis and blockchain solving this problem. Because how many people complain that the CEO of the Goodwill is making millions of dollars and whatever 5 cents of every dollar is what actually gets to the person you're trying to help. And so, yeah, this is a definite need in society and an application that can be used.
Yeah, so let me say, as somebody who comes from years of working in the nonprofit space, I certainly understand the need for significant overhead by many organizations, right? So I'm not a person who necessarily believes that you shouldn't think about an administrative portion of any dollar that you donate. That being said, I think there are clear examples of where diversion happens, and I think disaster relief is a classic example. So in the instance of disaster, people are very generous with their dollars. They tend to give a lot of money. They want it to go to a particular disaster. And the reality is it isn't always easy, to be fair to disaster relief charities, it isn't always easy to direct those dollars to certain causes. You have a lot of things like spoilage of food or duplication of efforts, et cetera. And if there were a way to track that on something like distributed ledger, you'd be able to say, okay, here's where, maybe it didn't go to providing, a temporary housing after this hurricane, but it did go to reconstruction efforts and it was localized in that community, right? So things like that, where I feel like it helps both ways. It helps the nonprofit prove that the dollars really were in support of that function for which they were intended, even if it wasn't specifically what the donor had in mind in terms of, helping in that immediate moment. But it localizes dollars in that way. It also, I think, reduces the sort of push some of these charities feel to deploy all those dollars in like week one after a disaster, which is frankly not when they're always mostly needed. So I think that providing that kind of record, will provide comfort on both sides and allow for a little bit more strategic deployment of some of these funds.
Exactly, and that would incentivize competition, because if more companies are going to be transparent with their funds that they get from donations, then people can say, okay, this company or this nonprofit will use my money to the best of their abilities, and it might be more efficient than these other 5 that I might have considered donating
Exactly.
to.
And one thing I'm very passionate about is local support, grassroots responses to solutions, particularly, to stick in the disaster context, who should be rebuilding the community? Should it be outside agencies? Should it be people from the community who want to rebuild their community the way that they feel their community needs to be rebuilt? And not all those names are household names, in, for example, the United States. So people don't donate there. And so you're relying on this outside agency to identify those organizations and kind of, give them funds doesn't always happen. So providing some additional accountability for on-the-ground organizations, I think, could be very valuable in terms of empowering local communities to support themselves, which I think is something that's missing a lot in the disaster context.
Wow. Well, Sheila Warren, everyone. Sheila, if you would, please share some closing thoughts here for the audience and let everyone know where they can reach out to you or find your work.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Kenneth. You can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm just at Sheila_Warren, SHEILA, or at the World Economic Forum here. I work in San Francisco. In closing, I think it's really critical that we think about any problem we're trying to solve before we apply a solution to it. And so I encourage strategic thinking in the blockchain space. I encourage the deployment of governance models in terms of thinking about when is blockchain useful and when is it maybe not useful or the technology is not quite ready. But I am very bullish on this technology. I think it's going to change the world, and I'm proud to be doing my small part to realize that vision.
Thank you, Sheila, for coming on Crush the Street, and keep up the good work. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kenneth. My pleasure.